In this video, we're going to talk about what exactly ASP.NET is and how it relates to ASP.NET MVC. ASP.NET is a very sensitive tablet that needs to be readjusted to be constrained to my primary monitor. And I'm going to go ahead and then now write it onto the whiteboard. So ASP.NET is sort of an umbrella technology. What I mean by that is there are a bunch of sub-projects underneath it that are all built on top of ASP.NET. ASP.NET's responsibility is simply to abstract a web server. Such as, most commonly, ASP.NET is paired with IIS, or Internet Information Services, which is the Windows web server, the web server built by Microsoft, which is available for free on I believe all computers starting from XP, and it's obviously available on all the server editions. So ASP.NET is an abstraction over a web server. That's all it does. It provides things like a request object, a response object, config for configuration. It provides just a bunch of stuff that allows us to communicate in code to a web server. And that's it. So it provides the foundation of a lot of things. On top of ASP.NET sits a couple other technologies. Some you may be familiar with, some you may not be. All these technologies are built by Microsoft. Obviously, there are more technologies that are built on ASP.NET, but these are the big ones. We have WebForms. We have MVC. We have WebAPI. And we have SingalR. So ASP.NET contains, these are all official Microsoft products, WebForms, MVC, WebAPI, and SingalR. Obviously, we're going to be talking about MVC, but I do want to mention these other technologies. So let's start off with the other ones, and then we'll get into MVC. WebForms was the first product to be built by ASP.NET, or on top of ASP.NET. In fact, it wasn't actually really separated from ASP.NET a long time ago when ASP.NET came out in 2001. ASP.NET and ASP.NET WebForms were basically synonyms. They meant the same thing. They're essentially the same technology. WebForms is an attempt by Microsoft to create a web development experience that feels like you're creating a desktop application. So what do you get? You get controls, and you get widgets, and you get event handlers, and WebForms just wires all that stuff up so it kind of, sort of, mostly, sort of, kind of works on the web.
Kind of, sort of.
Yeah, you can see I put kind of, sort of in there quite a few times for a purpose. I'm not trying to knock WebForms too hard, but I will say that it is a very heavy weight, and I think it really misses the point of what a website is. Now, obviously, it's a very, very rapid application development platform. You can use it to really quickly build up simple applications that work on the web, which is great, and that's what a lot of people use it for. But I don't find it very particularly appropriate for more modern web applications that you're kind of expecting to invest more time in to make a little bit leaner and nicer. WebForms is very, very large and has issues. It has a lot of abstractions that try to hide the complexity of the web, and sometimes they leak. And when you get a leaky abstraction, then you, well, drown.
Drowned. I like that. Is it a case then where essentially it's been outgrown?
I can't say that. Microsoft is still developing WebForms.
Okay.
They've made it actually significantly better over the last few years, although it still has the same issues, or a lot of the same issues, and people still use it. Again, primarily for really quick applications that perform simple tasks. Or
Okay.
maybe a really quick front end for an application that performs complex tasks that doesn't need to be pretty or particularly performant.
All right. So basically quick and fast functionality.
Right. If you want to tailor it to a specific need or really put in the time to customize it, you start running into the problem of the fact that because it provides so many things, that it makes configuring those things very difficult.
Gotcha.
Okay, let's skip over MVC for a second. Let's talk about Web API after I rewrite it, because that's still awful. Web API. Web API is, I believe, the newest addition to the ASP.NET family. It was introduced very recently, and it basically, all it is a framework for creating RESTful web services. This isn't a video about REST, so we're not going to really talk about that much, but it's Web API allows you to build web APIs. It allows you to build API endpoints into your application. And that's really all I can say about it.
All right.
Without getting into RESTful services and content negotiation, all that fun stuff.
Then thank God we're doing MVC.
Now, SingalR is lots of fun. SingalR is a real-time messaging platform built over WebSockets. It also has a fallback onto long polling. What I mean by that, if that completely did not make sense to anyone listening to this video, is that it takes advantage of some of the more modern technologies in HTML5 that allow a website to open up a real-time, bi-directional communication channel to a web server. As most of you guys know, when you hit a website, the web server processes your request, sends your browser a bunch of HTML, and your browser presents it to you. And that's it. The server and the client don't really talk much after that. With SingalR, it takes advantage of technologies that allow you to have your server actually communicate with your client, and allows your client to communicate with your server in real time.
Now, how's that useful?
Many scenarios. One is chat rooms. If you wanted to build a chat room inside of a website, you could use SingalR. If you wanted to build a multiplayer real-time video game in JavaScript on a website, you could do that with SingalR. If you want to get real-time notifications for anything, you can use SingalR. Basically, any time that the server needs to communicate to a client in real time without the client initiating the connection, you can use SingalR.
Cool. We like SingalR.
Yeah, SingalR is pretty slick. Then we have MVC, which obviously is what this video series is about, and it's taken us quite a bit of time to actually get to this point.
But it's good knowledge. That's what matters.
Yeah, I really wanted to demystify the ASP.NET Stack because it has a very long history and can be confusing sometimes. But anyway, so MVC was introduced. ASP.NET MVC was introduced in 2007, and it was obviously introduced as a competitor to Ruby on Rails. Ruby on Rails was a product that was built in 2004, or at least published in 2004, that popularized the idea that web development doesn't have to suck. Ruby on Rails was one of the first frameworks. There were some Java counterparts back then, I know, but Ruby on Rails was the first to become popular enough using the MVC pattern and showing people that the MVC pattern can be applied very well to the web. Now, a bunch of copycats sprung out of that, and one of those was ASP.NET MVC, where Microsoft took a step back and they looked at their web forms and were like, well, these are kind of, they're kind of sluggish and they're kind of difficult to customize. Let's follow this Rails route a little bit. Let's take some inspiration from them. It's not a complete carbon copy. We'll learn more about that later, but let's take a little bit inspiration from them and build something that is lean and fast and very easy to use, and is supported by a multi-billion-dollar corporation. So MVC was kind of born out of that, and that's one of the reasons why it exists today. So it came out in 2007. I personally started using it on version 2, somewhere around early 2010. And then, fortunately, that we quickly moved into version 3, which introduced some really nice features. And now, at this point, we're on version 4, which is very nice. But so MVC was introduced, and it really started to, or at least it re-legitimized ASP.NET as a viable platform for modern web development. In fact, WebAPI and SingalR were well, not so much SingalR, but WebAPI borrows a lot from MVC as it came out after. So when MVC came out, Microsoft, what they wanted to do was they've been slowly transitioning to make ASP.NET look like this diagram that we see right here. Because remember, WebForms used to be synonymous with ASP.NET. But when they introduced MVC, they kind of separated things out and give us what we are looking at right now with this diagram. Can you think of any of the reasons why that might be important, Steve?
Well, like in the last video where I just quickly rattled off ASP.NET instead of adding the MVC to it, you could have some confusion if you're not listing that whole thing. They're all going to do different stuff, and you need to understand which one you're working with.
Yes. That actually isn't exactly what I was getting at, but it is actually more of an interesting point than the point that I was trying to get at. So I'm just going to, yeah.
Right. Yay!
Yay! Basically, yeah. It's important to differentiate which one of these technologies you're working with. But it's also important that you can actually combine these technologies together. You can have a project that has an MVC front end, a WebForms backend. Like when I say backend, I mean things like an order processor or customer search database or something. Using WebAPI for your API endpoints, and then using SingalR for your real-time communication.
And that plays into when you said ASP.NET itself is really kind of an umbrella.
Right. It's an umbrella that provides abstractions to communicate to a web server.
Gotcha.
And that is what ASP.NET is. And then these are the products that are built underneath it, which again can be combined together to make applications. Very commonly, you'll see these three grouped together in projects. The MVC part will serve out the initial page request. It'll sometimes hit WebAPI for information, and it'll use SingalR for real-time communication. That's a very common pairing of technologies, where WebForms is just kind of sitting out there all lonely.
Cool. Except for WebForms being lonely and all.
Well, again, it's getting. I try not to bash technologies because I understand that there's a time and a place for most technologies out there. And anybody who knows me personally knows the exception to that rule, but I'm not going to put it on video. But there's a time and a place for most technologies, and I don't want to bash WebForms. And if it sounds like something interesting to learn, I would encourage you to learn it because it has gotten better over the years. But this series we're focusing primarily on MVC. Are there any other high-level questions that you might have, Steve? Because I think we've talked enough theory so far.
No, I think I'm following along pretty good, all things considered. And beyond that, I probably don't have the knowledge for any really good, relevant questions.
The last point I want to wrap up with, this is for you PHP developers out there. ASP.NET handles applications as a single unit rather as a collection of scripts, meaning that your projects actually get compiled into DLLs and are loaded into IIS as running applications, meaning they're not individual scripts that are hit and processed and then forgotten about. I just wanted to throw that in there, and we'll talk more about how that impacts our actual code very shortly here.
Cool.
Okay.
All right. Slowly but surely, I'm following.
I think that just about wraps up all the theory, and we're ready to get, jumping into some actual code.
Woohoo!
Yay. Alrighty.